We're here in Detroit before the second Democratic debate. Bernie Sanders is going to debate tonight, and joining us is Sarah Ford. She's the Deputy Communications Director for Bernie Sanders.
Hey, Jen, thanks for having me.
Of course, great to have you, Sarah. So, communications for Bernie Sanders. Well, we got the debate coming up. So, Kamala Harris had a huge moment against Joe Biden by taking him on. Have you guys planned to punch anyone in the face?
To us, the debates are obviously a very important part of the primary process. Bernie treats them as an opportunity to educate voters about what his policy plan is, his platform, his record, and his vision for the country. So while it's important to make contrast with other candidates, we feel that this is the stage to make sure that voters know that when they vote for Bernie Sanders, they're getting someone that would give them transformative change, changing and taking on a rigged economic system, which is certainly different from other candidates on the stage. So tonight, I think that's what we'll see from him is really important contrasts.
So that sounds like the Bernie Sanders we know, which is, look, I'm going to give you what I got. This is the same thing I've been saying for 40 years, but that's because I mean it, etc. But and you answer whatever you're comfortable with, but do some folks on the team counsel him to be more aggressive with the other candidates? Does that fall on deaf ears, or is that an actual conversation that happens?
Well, this is Bernie's campaign, right? And he's campaigned this way for a very long time. So at the end of the day, it's Bernie making the decisions up on stage, but he does have a really incredible team behind him that is counseling him to certainly make these sort of contrasts that I'm talking about, because this is a much bigger field than what we faced in 2016, right? And it's important for voters to know, this is how I'm different from other candidates. Instead of being against something, which a lot of candidates I think we'll see on the stage will do, he's certainly for this transformative, bold, progressive policy. And that's what we hope to talk about tonight, is the policies that will directly affect the American people, and most importantly, how other candidates' plans may not be so bold and progressive and help.
Yeah, well, so that's the interesting part, right? So Elizabeth Warren, according to the polling, won the first night of the debates last time around, okay? According to the polling, Kamala Harris won the second night. But Warren actually won by a bigger margin than Kamala Harris did. But Kamala Harris moved up more in the polling. Why? Because that moment with Biden was repeated approximately 10 billion times throughout the rest of the media, right? And more people saw that than saw the debate itself.
Right.
So I assume that the team, Bernie's team, is cognizant of that.
Of course.
When you guys have a conversation about that, does Bernie say, yeah, that's fine, but I don't care because I'm Bernie? Or does he go, oh, I get it, and maybe I should contrast myself to someone?
So if we were all to have it our way, we would have as much time as possible to talk about Bernie's policies, but we are understanding and cognizant of what the format of these debates are, which means you have to talk shorter, you have to talk in sound bites. So when it comes to prep, we do talk about some of those things, but we understand that to play on the air after the fact, like, we have to play the game. And certainly sometimes the format of these debates is not super supportive of a substantive policy debate, which we're going to try for anyway, because that is our bottom line, to make sure people know what is at stake in this country. And I think the biggest thing on that stage tonight and tomorrow that we need to look for is who has the vision and the plan to actually take on Donald Trump in a general election.
Right. So now, one of the things the mainstream media wants you to do, and let's keep it real, right? We want you to fight against the non-progressives. The mainstream media wants you to fight Elizabeth Warren, right?
Yes.
So what's the internal thinking on that issue about Warren?
Look, I don't think progressives need to be fighting with each other. That's not the debate that the party itself needs to be having at this moment. Truthfully, I think the beauty of this primary is that American voters will get to see two staunchly progressive candidates, top-tier candidates on the stage together, which is unheard of. If you look back 4 years ago, that was just us. And at the time, people were saying, Medicare for all is crazy, that's never going to happen. And the interesting thing now is the question is not, do we as a party, do we want universal health care? It's how do we get there? Right, and I think that's the argument and the debate that we'll be seeing between the progressives. Certainly the more moderate neoliberal candidates will come for Bernie, but at the end of the day, he's the one with the vision to actually support the American people and what they need.
So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Bernie, because you just hit on the most important thing there is, which is how do we get there?
Right.
So it's all good and fine to get a progressive elected president. It's enormous, hasn't happened in my lifetime.
Yeah.
2 progressives in the presidential race hasn't happened in my lifetime. But at the end of the day, if we get a progressive elected president, but we don't pass any bills, we've accomplished absolutely nothing in my book.
Right.
Okay. So Bernie's plan for getting Michael Bennet to vote for legislation that he right now says he doesn't agree with. You could pick him. It could be Medicare for all. It could be Green New Deal. It could be almost anything that he's proposed. Michael Bennett's a lovely guy, but he just you know, he says he doesn't philosophically agree. I think his donors don't agree. But how do you move the so-called Democratic colleagues?
Sure. So Bernie, I think, has showed how you can be a leader both inside the system and without it, right? In the 3 years since he ran for president, he proved how we can move politics outside of Washington, D.C. He rallies people, he creates a movement in a way that no other candidate can do. And truthfully, any candidate on stage, not Bernie, not anyone else, can transform our politics alone. We need a grassroots movement of millions of people who can put pressure on our political leaders to vote in favor of things like Medicare for All or other bills that they may not otherwise. And Bernie Sanders is a singular candidate that has the power to do that.
Let me just prod one more step on that, because it's easy enough to say, and I've heard Bernie say it a million times, hey, we're going to have a movement. And that's absolutely true, and you need it. And Obama told all of his supporters to stand down as soon as he became president and took the power away from them. I imagine that Bernie Sanders would do the opposite, and I believe him on that. There's no, like, I think anyone who follows Bernie believes him on that, right? But what form does that take, right? So, okay, now you've got all these people who are, let's keep it real, are going to be mad at the folks voting against Medicare for All. And pick any senator that's in that, Feinstein. Feinstein is, in my opinion, I'm not saying that you're saying this, is a corporate tool, right? She's not going to vote for any of these progressive proposals. So what do you do with a problem like Feinstein?
I think, again, it comes to, when he talks about transformative change in this country, it boils down to our political system as well. For many decades, the American people have not felt like politics or politicians work for them. They feel disengaged in the process. They feel left out of the process. And that's why, a lot of policies, progressive policies in particular, have failed to reach a vote in the House and in the Senate. But I think, again, it comes down to when we build an actual movement of these things that we are talking about. And Bernie's able to do that by bringing new people into the political process. We are very capable of getting in newly registered voters, disenfranchised voters. It is about building a progressive coalition who is willing to take on the special interest. Because at the end of the day, too, a lot of these politicians, some that you mentioned, are taking campaign contributions from kind of the elite class in this country, right? The pharmaceutical company, the health insurance industries, the fossil fuel companies, right? And they are often beholden to those people and not the voters, right? And if we pass some of these policies that Bernie is talking about, like Medicare for All, and a boldly addressing climate change, fixing our broken immigration system, we are directly challenging the corporate powers of this country, who often some of our politicians work for directly, right? It's about taking on the higher class and building a movement of people who can directly challenge it.
Sarah, the reason I press on that, given that you're doing communications, is I think a lot of progressives are, and honestly I am, looking for, among the different progressives running in this race, who's going to be the one that has the courage to call out those so-called colleagues in a way that will be effective. Not just for the sake of venting, that's useless, right? But for the sake of saying, no, I will take on the systemic corruption. Because I'm just going to keep it super real here, right? If Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, our audience senses, is going to pull their punches with their colleagues and is afraid to offend them, we're not going to get anything done, right? So yet in this campaign, I haven't seen Sanders or Warren call out a single Democratic senator and say, hey, you know what? If I get elected and Feinstein votes no on Medicare for All, I'm coming for her, right? So Bernie came the closest in the interview I did with him when he said he'd go do a rally in West Virginia if Manchin votes no, right? But do you guys have a sense of that? Or is Bernie just he's been in the Senate a long, long time, and those guys keep saying, hey, Bernie, we're on your team, don't offend us. Then they go and have dinners behind his back trying to make sure he loses, right? Is he willing to name names and say, I'm going to take on the systemic, not personal like Donald Trump, not personal corruption, but systemic corruption of the system? Right.
I mean, I think he's certainly proven that he's willing to do that, both within our traditional political system and outside of it. I mean, look back when he had his Medicare for All bill, he had so many co-sponsors of that bill who 3 years ago would not touch even the idea of Medicare for All. I think the tides are truly changing in this country. However, he is the one candidate that is willing to hold them accountable to their promises. And we saw this yesterday with Kamala Harris's healthcare bill. She did sign on as a co-sponsor to Medicare for All, but she put out a plan that truthfully is not Medicare for All. It's ensuring that the private insurance companies, that the big pharma companies can continue to own the system and make it a profit-based one instead of one that protects care for patients, right? So I think this is an example of that. We did come out pretty strong against that plan because, you know, she said when she was a co-sponsor that she supports Medicare for all, but at the end of the day, the plan that she put out yesterday was not Medicare for all. It was allowing the private insurance companies to continue collecting millions and billions of dollars per year.
Well, the New York Times says that it's more pragmatic to have a 10-year transition period. By that logic, I think we should go for a 100-year transition period, and then it'll be super realistic.
Right.
Okay, so as you can tell, I agree with you that Kamala Harris's plan is not really Medicare for all. And look, one of the things we're doing through this cycle is, in the beginning, we started with, let's hear them all out. Let's be fair, right?
Right.
And this is what the process is. And in the process, we heard out Kamala Harris, and it turns out her plan is not Medicare for all. I wish it was. I wish there were 3 strong progressives in the race, because that would amplify our message. But as it turns out, there's 2 strong progressive leaders,
right,
and Kamala Harris is choosing a middle path. And so now we know, and partly because of the pressure of the campaign and Bernie Sanders' proposals in the first place. That leads me to the last question, which is your problem, your perpetual problem with the corporate media and what you do with it.
Yeah.
So anytime Bernie Sanders puts out a proposal, it's considered, in the old days it was always radical and unrealistic. Now it's either radical and unrealistic or, well, already accepted, so it's irrelevant, right? Okay, so the fact that they can't see that bias is stunning to me. Every day I'm stunned by it. But whenever Kamala Harris or Michael Bennet puts out a proposal that basically wouldn't change anything, they're like, wonderful, realistic, pragmatic, et cetera, et cetera. How do you deal with that every day and get, like, how do you use it? I don't know if it's jujitsu, et cetera, to help Bernie win the election rather than having it be literally billions of dollars spent in negative advertising against it.
Right. And I even just read today that in the debates tonight, there are a special interest group that will be running ads against Medicare for All on CNN. This is an example of what we are up against, particularly when it comes to this policy. But at the end of the day, you know, we have to use the media as a way to get the message out, because on policies like Medicare for All and others, poll after poll shows that when you explain the details of it, support grows, right? So we have to work within the system of mainstream media, because when Bernie gets out there and he shares his message with voters, it resonates and it works, and that's how we grow support. But at the same time, like, we are able to use outside measures of outreach to supporters. We have our own podcast, we have our own live show, we have great programs like the Young Turks, who will cover policy in depth. And that is what voters truly want. They want to talk about policy. They want to know how things will affect their lives. The day-to-day horse race is not something that resonates with voters, right? The media loves it, and the media would love to see a fight between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie tonight. But what the people actually want, the American voters, is a substantial discussion on policy.
So last thing as a follow-up to that, has there been discussion internally in the communications team and with Senator Sanders about being more aggressive with the mainstream media and calling them out and saying, hey, look, you guys are part of the corruption. And so when you say, hey, Medicare for all is not popular, that's actually not true. You know, you do this push polling that helps the Republican Party and the corporate Democrats, et cetera. I mean, just a full-throated, like, you guys are kind of the bad guys. You're for the status quo, or is that considered too alienating? And I know that it's a fine line and it's a tough balancing act.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, they're not at their core bad people, right? Journalists do
Agreed,
extraordinarily important work. You know, we would not have a democratic system without the work of reporters, right? But I would say we also are aggressive in fact-checking and making sure that they are covering both Bernie and the policy that he's talking about on a factual level. And we call out bias when we see it, because that's the fair thing to do. If we want to have a fair democratic primary process, the media needs to be covering candidates in a fair way, and we're happy to have that conversation and happy to have that fight.
I think you guys should start calling them what they are, which is conservative. Not on social issues, but on economic issues. The media, it has a conservative bias.
Yeah.
And so until people get have an understanding of that, they won't understand why the media attacks every progressive economic policy with great fervor.
Right, and truthfully, there's a lack of diversity within the punditry class. not just on a diverse level, but a diversity of ideology, a diversity of perspective, right? When you turn on CNN or you turn on MSNBC, what you're hearing on these panels is mostly people who are creatures of DC, right? They don't have the perspective of the average American voter. They don't understand how our current economic system affects them. So what we would love to see and what we try and do is offer them the opportunity to have a broad set of perspectives in their coverage.
All right, Sarah Ford, Deputy Communications Director for Bernie Sanders, thank you so much
Thanks
for joining us.
having me.
Appreciate
It's good
it.
to see you.